Welcome everybody to this Press Club of Long Island panel discussion. My name is Brendan O'Reilly and I'm the president of the PCLI board. We're the Long Island chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. Tonight's event is about how the media has covered diversity issues in the time that's passed since the murder of George Floyd and the summer of 2020 Black Lives Matter protests. We saw a surge in coverage at that time and it has died down a bit, and we want to ask, is the interest in covering important diversity issues and racial justice going to be sustained? Our moderator tonight is the chairman of the Press Club of Long Island Diversity and Inclusion Committee, Nakeem Grant. Nakeem, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Brendan. Good evening, everyone. Just wanted to say thank you again to the panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules to join tonight's discussion. And thank you to the guests who are still filing in for joining tonight's discussion as well and listening in from wherever they are. So yeah, I mean, as Brendan said, just to briefly reiterate, you know, there's been, of course, as we've seen in the news, there's been many prevalent issues, both locally and nationally, that are occurring right now. But we really, at the PCLI, we really wanted to continue to be able to shed light on, you know, what was a very prevalent subject back in the summer of 2020. And so, yeah, tonight we really hope that we can continue to shed some light on that and, you know, really discuss different methods and different ways that different newsrooms and different journalists and reporters are continuing to, you know, cover this prevalent issue, which is, you know, diversity issues, especially on a local level. And so I'm going to start with the first question that I have for our panelists this evening is, you know, what kind of stories came about during your coverage at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement in June of 2020. And we'll start with Amy Waldman. She's the assistant news director at News 12 Long Island. She previously served as the news director at Pix 11 and as an interim executive director for the New York chapter of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. So Amy, so yeah, first question for you, Amy, I guess, what kind of stories came about during your coverage at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement back in May and June of 2020?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I think, you know, what we really wanted to make sure we did in the summer of 2020 is tell stories that reflect our community. So obviously we covered the demonstrations that happened in the summer of 2020, but we really wanted to hear in people's own words what was going on. So we actually started a segment called Reflection on Race, and we went out into the community. We had people talk about their experiences growing up on Long Island. And it was really interesting to hear those personal accounts of what it was like, the racism that people endured here, and how things have changed, but really haven't changed. And I think that was so important to hear firsthand accounts of what it was like. And, you know, we've really tried to continue to cover stories that matter to our viewers, right? I mean, Long Island is very diverse, but not everybody covers stories in all communities. We want to make sure that we're covering the good stories too. It shouldn't be stories about, you know, crimes that happen. It should be stories that are uplifting as well. And I think that was one of the things that we kept hearing. So, you know, at News 12, we're really trying to focus on things that matter to the community.
Absolutely. And same question for our other panelists, Amudalat Ajasa. She serves as the Ida B. Wells Society intern at the New York Times. She's reporting from their investigative desk, and she's also a recent graduate of Hofstra University, who is also a native of St. Paul, Minnesota, where she's reported for many local outlets there as well. So same question to you, Amudalat. You know, what kind of stories came about during your coverage at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement back in the summer of 2020?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really honored to be here and to be asked to speak on this. As you said, I am a Minnesota native, so it was almost kind of like a weird dystopia being from Minnesota, living 15 minutes from where George Floyd was murdered. We can say murdered now. And the coverage was really intense. And I think it sowed a lot of distrust with media. And I think in some ways a lot of media outlets tried to do better, but I think their coverage of what was happening didn't hit the mark. So it caused a lot of people to be more hesitant to talk to media and to trust them to cover their stories, especially non-Black and non-BIPOC journalists. So I think those discussions about having people who are in the community from those communities covering those topics really became prevalent. I think it's always kind of been prevalent, but it really, it came to a head during that time. And I think a lot of the stories were, I know I interviewed this white couple and they were like, I didn't know racism was still that bad in this country. So I think the coverage was really intense because it forced, the video alone was intense, but the coverage was really intense and it forced people to recognize something that they might not have had to experience in their day-to-day lives as non-Black people. And for Black and BIPOC people, it kind of, I guess this sounds bad, but confirmed what we might have been experiencing on micro and even sometimes macro levels. But it all really came to a head. And I would say I was slightly frustrated in some of the coverage I would see because as a Minnesotan, I was near everything that was happening. I was having conversations with people on the streets and it was really close to home. And then I would see coverage that just was wildly inaccurate about what was happening. I don't know if it was in terms of facts or framing, but like as somebody in the media, it was frustrating for me to watch. So I could only imagine how people who were, very active felt reading those things that weren't really true about what was happening.
Those are very great points, especially on the, as you mentioned, the intensity, just having personally covered some of the local demonstrations, I can speak for myself and many of the other local reporters as well, how intense things got, on both sides, whether we were covering it or whether it was, people who were out there making a demonstration. So that's a very good point. And our next panelist, Robert Levin, he is a deputy assistant managing editor at Newsday, and he currently runs the breaking news desk. His team also covers local happenings, trending topics, and national issues as they pertain to Long Island. And he's also a Long Beach resident, so he's a hyperlocal reporter as well. Robert, same question. What kind of stories really came about or came across your desk, at the height of this Black Lives Matter movement back in the summer of 2020?
Well, I think it was apparent really early that this was just a really seminal moment. It was, unfortunately, stories of horrific police brutality. This was not the first one, but it within days, it was very clear to us, I think, that there was something going on here that was probably in some respects bigger than we could have initially imagined. So I think, it began with covering as many of the protests as we could, as comprehensively as we could, and trying to take the time while doing that to kind of step back and be able to take a sort of broader look at, exactly what was going on here and to really get into the sense of, what communities were experiencing. I, as an editor, I spend most of my time, I would say 98% of my time, sitting at this desk, right? So, it was all about kind of figuring out, how to not just to cover the protests, but to not just cover the protests, but to step back and to say, we're as everyone always says, we're the first draft of history. So how do we capture this sort of in real time? And I think one of the ways was to make a point of finding people who were worthy of profiling for different reasons, who brought something interesting and different, who came to the protests because of their own life experiences, and finding a way to expand on them and tell their stories. So we pulled back and we put together a bunch of different profiles of different people who had been compelled, perhaps for the first time, to come out and participate in demonstrations like this, and to use this really as a kind of a launching point for examining, getting at. I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where we can say we are 100% happy with the way we cover diverse communities. There is a lot of work to do, and there always has been, and there will continue to be. But it was really kind of a seminal point for us where we were able to sort of say, there really is something going on here, and we need to start listening to people. I mean, Newsday has a history of covering these issues well, but also, a flawed history too. I mean, our Long Island Divided series in 2019 was obviously pretty prominent and important, but, on a day-to-day basis, we, like everyone else, really struggled with this. And, and I think it was a chance to kind of, while dealing with the sort of rapid pace of events and the reality that there were just a lot of protests all over, and it's hard for any of us to cover an entire island that's as big as this one is, but to really kind of step back and think about and begin kind of a process of making sense of how to go about taking, understanding and capturing what the narrative really was in kind of a larger way. So, there were profiles, I remember there was, I don't remember who tweeted it specifically, but there was a 5-year-old girl at a Merrick protest who went viral for marching there. We interviewed her and her mother and wrote a big piece on them. It was looking for stuff like this. And I don't think we did it perfectly. I think there are things we probably could do differently, but that was sort of the goal, and it's a journey that really continues.
Absolutely. No, that's such a great point. And the video you referenced, by the way, was actually shot by Scott Brinton, who is a PCLI board member and past president. So, small world. But yeah, he was the one who shot that video. And of course, as you know, that went viral within a week. I think as of now, it has close to 10 million hits right now. And of course, it was everywhere in Google ads and on national television. And that story just blew up. So, a very key point that you brought up in terms of, how the local voices really stood out during this coverage, and how so many different people from different backgrounds really came about to, speak out on these issues at that time. And for our fourth panelist, Maya Brown, she is an associate social news gathering reporter at NBC News, where she's currently focusing on monitoring social media platforms for both breaking, feature, and trending news stories. And she also reports them out as well. She's a recent graduate of Stony Brook University, where she majored in journalism and political science. And same question for you, Maya. I guess what kind of stories came about during your coverage of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the summer of 2020?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And sorry if I sound nasally, I'm a little sick with the cold, so sorry about that. But yeah, so I remember during that time, we were all sent home as a student journalist working with the paper, and we were all sent home, and we were wondering, okay, like, let's talk about this, what can we do to cover this? So I remember myself and the rest of the editorial board of my campus newspaper, we all got on a conversation and we said, okay, let's talk about this. Let's express our feelings. And one thing that was brought up was that we wanted to make sure that we're not reporting it as if like the Black Lives Matter movement is something new. We wanted to make sure that everybody knew it wasn't something new. It was something that's been ongoing for a long time, and that these issues have been ongoing for a long time. So that was definitely something that I think helped in our reporting. And then we also started to cover it. We started to cover protests that were happening in each of our towns. So I remember going to a protest. A lot of our reporters, like in Ohio, in different parts of Long Island, upstate, we were all covering the protests that were occurring across the country, because obviously it was something that was affecting the world. It was something that it sparked a movement. So that was definitely one of the first things that we did. And another thing is we tried to hold people accountable that were now supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement. So when our university came out with a statement and everything and saying that, they're in support, they're going to provide resources for people who may need it, we started looking into it to make sure that it's not just words, but there's also actions behind it. Like, what actions are being done? Are there task forces? Are there supportive, mental health groups being formed? So I remember seeing that our university uses prison labor goods that are made in prison, basically. And they have a contract with Corecraft, which gets all the goods, like the desks, the chairs that our university uses, is made through prison labor. So I brought that up and I wrote an article about it. I spoke to a professor that also wrote an op-ed on it, because it's kind of wrong to say you support, Black Lives Matter and then also use prison-made goods, because we all know that a large amount of men that are incarcerated are African American. So that was also a big part of our coverage. And then it kind of sparked podcasts and different coverage from different newspapers on campus. So that was just kind of a little bit of what sparked after George Floyd's murder.
Absolutely, very good points, Maya. Thank you for sharing that. And each of you kind of led right into my touched on my second question a bit, which is, have there been discussions in your newsrooms about follow-up stories on these subjects around diversity issues? And I guess what kind of approach really have each of you taken on continued coverage of diversity issues? So I'll start from the back with Maya. You can take this question to start. I guess, what kind of approach have you taken on diversity issues, if you can just reiterate a bit on that?
Yeah, for sure. So I remember shortly after that, so not in 2020, but in 2021, we had also just to share that our newsroom is majority white people as well. I think myself and maybe a few others were people of color. So I remember in 2021, we came out with a Black History Month special issue, because we have special issues, and we wanted to do one for Black History Month. And we really honed in on, Black culture and Black people and Black news. And I think that was a really good push. And I think it was received really well. We did a lot of surveys also after George Floyd about how Black people felt on campus at a predominantly white school. We did a lot of surveys seeing how many Black faculty are there on campus. We really honed in, I think, on that aspect of diversity. And everybody says we're diverse, but are we really, are we segregated? So I think that really helped drive that conversation. I haven't seen it be out of the conversation either, which is really good. I think it helped a lot of newsrooms focus on diversity and looking at, okay, we can have diversity, but is everyone being heard, And then I think that's our main thing that we did with these surveys that we constantly put out in the past 2 years was, are you being heard? Do you feel safe? Do you feel, do you feel appreciated, at the school? So that's definitely some of the conversations that's been going on in the student newsroom, at least.
Absolutely, Maya. That's such a great point that you brought up, the importance of having a diverse newsroom, especially, or at the very least, as you mentioned, a newsroom that is cognizant of the different backgrounds and ethnicities in the communities that they're covering. So that's such a prevalent point. Same question for you, Robert. I guess, has there been discussions, in your newsroom about, doing follow-up stories on the diversity issues? And again, what kind of approach, have you taken in terms of being able to continue to, cover these issues?
Yeah, it's an incredibly high priority for us. And I think it begins with two things. One is being honest. I am sitting here as someone who cannot necessarily bring a lot to the table when it comes to this. So it starts with recognizing that newsrooms have diversity problems. They just about all of them do, and just not hiding from that, not disguising it, working to fix it. So it starts with being honest. It includes really listening to people. We bring in community groups from all over the island, Sikh community, people with disabilities, the list goes on, hearing about what their priorities are, understanding, what they would like to see, being open and receptive to criticism, which we have to be. We have an obligation to recognize that Long Island is an incredibly diverse place, far more diverse, I think, than coverage of Long Island would typically suggest. I think most people would agree here. And so, it's being honest about that. It's listening to people, and it's recognizing that, you don't necessarily have all the answers, and what you might perceive to be a story or something that resonates with you is not necessarily something that's going to resonate with someone else, and that the job is ultimately for all of us. It's not about necessarily about us, but it's about serving our readers and serving in our case to our viewers, and really reflecting what's going on in their communities. So there isn't really a perfect answer. There isn't an instantaneous easy fix, but it's a constant effort, and it's something that we work on. We try to, produce stories that aren't just limited, say, to Black History Month, but that span the gamut of the year, that run that as I believe Amy said, that aren't just negative stories about crime, but are positive and are substantial, and look at people who are accomplishing. You could just have a whole newspaper of just horrible negative stuff every day, but we want to spotlight things like Fulbright scholars. We just did a couple of pieces, one of whom was a woman from I believe she's from Guyana, I believe. I could have that slightly wrong, but she's SUNY Old Westbury's first Fulbright, and we want to just tell stories that really get at the realities here, which is that, this is a very diverse and interesting place, and the people involved in making these decisions, including me, are not necessarily people who are living amongst that. And so you have to have humility and be honest. And I think that if I had to summarize the approach in general, it's being willing and ready to listen to people.
No, those are great points, Robert. Thank you for sharing that. Just briefly, during my years at the Herald as an editor, that's something that we discussed heavily, was the importance of understanding the diversity of Long Island, being that it is really a melting pot. The North Shore and the South Shore of Long Island are just two completely different communities, from social status to the ethnicities and so on and so forth. So really understanding the communities that you're covering, really plays a huge role, as you mentioned, in how we're portraying, people of diverse backgrounds in each community. I feel like that's very important, as you mentioned, Robert, being able to understand the communities that you're covering and the different kind of people in your community, so that you're fully representing them and not just painting them in one particular light. So those are very prevalent points that you brought up, Robert. Thank you. And same question for Amudalat. What kind of discussions have there been in your newsroom in terms of, doing follow-up stories on the subjects of diversity issues? And I guess for you personally, what kind of approach have you taken in continuing to, shed light on the subject?
Yeah, well, I think the history of neglecting Black voices has kind of been prevalent throughout American, society. So I think making sure that those voices have a platform is very key. And that involves making sure that you are building positive relationships with the community. A story that comes to mind is after George Floyd was murdered, I started, I pitched to The Guardian and was able to write for them throughout the Derek Chauvin murder trial. And I really wanted to do a piece about George Floyd Square. And like the community leaders who were, it was basically this autonomous zone that was basically purely run by community leaders who had lived in the area. And they refused to talk to journalists because of how negatively they had been portrayed. And again, this is a quick anecdote, but I was grilled for 30 minutes. They quit, I was basically tested. And I was kind of given this weird exclusive interview to talk to some of the leaders who formally wouldn't have spoken, but I think that's what's very key. And like other people said, highlighting positive things. I know I did a story about the oldest Black newspaper in the state for The Guardian at the 2 years after a year after George Floyd was murdered. We wrote about that. And I also would argue that even when stories aren't necessarily about race, there's almost always a race lens or angle that you can write from. If you're doing an econ story, I know we were working on a story or my friend was telling me about a story about this new train going up in this neighborhood, and there was a white reporter, and my first question was, which neighborhood is this train going through, or is this a predominantly person of color community? And they said, oh, she hadn't even thought about that angle. She didn't talk to any of the people. And I was like, maybe that's because I'm Black and that's my first mindset, but I think highlighting the fact that a story doesn't have to be about Black people or people of color to ultimately have that lens, because that's the lens in which we view the world anyways. So making sure that when we're writing in a holistic way, and that the voices that we're including are diverse, and you're not doing a story about Black History Month and you're not talking to Black people, and you're only talking to corporate companies who are profiting, or just like making sure that you're exhausting all the angles so that all the voices that need to be in a piece are heard. So that's how I would say I exercise my diversity when covering stories past George Floyd.
No, absolutely. Amudalat, that's such a great approach. As you mentioned, being able to, take this from a journalistic standpoint, and as you mentioned, focusing on every angle instead of just focusing on one specific angle, and really, painting the story in one particular way, when it can really be approached from so many different angles, depending on the kind of sources that you reach out to. So, whether it be local sources, whether it be local leaders or residents in the community or what have you, being able to reach out to people of different social statuses, people of different backgrounds. I feel like, as you mentioned, that makes for a well-rounded story. And then, as you mentioned, the story from there will speak for itself, just based upon the sources that you were able to gather. So very good point. You can go ahead, Amudalat.
And just a quick addition, I think knowing what's happening in the community is also very important in the coverage of your pieces. So I know once COVID was impacting Black communities, that's a topic. Talking about hesitation to get the vaccine, knowing what's happening in the communities that you're covering, instead of like bopping in when there's an issue and then bopping out, like removing yourself from all forms of like communication, is also very key. Sorry, I felt like I had to add that. So.
No, those are such great points. Thank you for sharing that. So yeah, Amy, same question again. What kind of discussions have there been in your newsroom, just on follow-up stories about diversity issues? And I guess, what kind of approach have you taken in terms of being able to shine some light on these diversity issues?
Yeah, there have been a lot of discussions here. We, like all other newsrooms, do not have a very diverse newsroom. So it's really important to make sure that we allow all voices to be heard. I think that something Robert said that really hit home was that you have to be open to criticism. I think for us, there aren't a lot of diverse people in our newsroom, and we've really tried to get our newsroom to look a little bit more like the community that we serve, and it's not that easy. So making sure that we're aware of our faults and allowing people to have their voices heard in this newsroom is really important. And then I also think being part of the community, creating relationships with leaders on Long Island and making sure that the stories that they're hearing are stories that are told to us, so we can go out and cover them. I think, making sure that our reporters are out on the streets talking to people, and making sure that every different type of person on Long Island is part of our stories. And I think, we would go out and do a story and, get 5 interviews. And if those 5 people look the same, that's not a well-rounded story. So our reporters are really aware of that now, making sure that their stories include everybody.
Absolutely. No, that's such a great point. As you mentioned again, just the importance of being able to get different voices. It just makes for so much more of a well-rounded story. I mean, like I said, again, at my time at the Herald, our readers would let us know, via letters to the editor, whether or not we got enough voices or different voices for each story. I feel like our readers are really, hip to that, not only at the Herald, but at many other news outlets as well. So it's very important to, as you mentioned, Amy, to get those different voices and make sure that you're not getting the same person on camera, or the same kind of person on camera, or on the record, who's, sharing their insight. So that's very important to, hit on those different notes to be able to create a well-rounded story. For my last question, sort of touching on what I mentioned at the top of this discussion, the fact that there's so many different prevalent issues going on in the world right now on a national and a local level, whether it be, gun laws, whether it be Roe that it's having, on a local and national level, of course, all very prevalent issues. But I feel like somewhere in that mix, diversity issues still needs to be at the top of these discussions in terms of our local coverage, both here on Long Island and, the greater New York area. And so I guess my question to the panelists would be, do you each feel like there's been enough continued coverage of diversity issues since, the June 2020 demonstrations? I mean, I know I've seen and read stories here and there about, follow-up stories on some of the issues, especially in recent months, surrounding diversity issues and some of the positives that have come about through covering diversity issues. So I've seen stories here and there, but I'm just curious to hear from our fellow panelists if they've seen enough continued coverage, or if they feel there's enough continued coverage. And secondly, on top of that, what kind of stories would you like to see more of going forward regarding diversity issues? I'll start with Amudalat for this question.
I was gathering my thoughts. Okay. My first instinct is to say no. I think when I went to George Floyd Square to get the verdict of, to get Derek Chauvin's verdict after his trial, when I was one of the first reporters there, and mind you, I was just freelancing for The Guardian, and I was one of the first ones there. And after we got the verdict, obviously then the swarms of media came. But people there were saying, we are going to fight whether the media wants to cover us or give us a voice or not. So it seems like there was kind of this feeling of disappointment. The Derek Chauvin murder trial happened months and months after. So when the coverage started to kind of fade, it felt as though that was no longer a conversation people felt like they needed to have. And I feel like our job is to, in some ways, I wouldn't say remind the public, but to make sure that we're highlighting key issues. And even with this is a completely different example, but with the Ukraine coverage, I mean, there's still an ongoing war that nobody's really talking about anymore. And you have to almost seek out updates. So it feels like there's a weird level of sensationalism where when people are boots on the ground and things are, up in flames, that's when everything is interesting to cover. And then when it's everyday things that people are fighting against in terms of systemic oppression and aggressions, even the killing of that, even the killing of those Black people upstate New York, I feel like that wasn't talked about enough for me, at least in my opinion. I was just like, wow, this was a day. We had a day of grieving, and then it was on to the next news cycle. So I feel like I don't think there's enough coverage on important things. And I mean, obviously I wouldn't know as a reporter how, as a new reporter too at that, to kind of combat the higher ups and say, I feel like you guys aren't covering what needs to be covered. But I would say, no, I feel like the conversations are a bit, have definitely died down. I don't know if it's due to interest or people feeling like they got tired of seeing all of the negative. I know a lot of people are like, it's so much negative all the time, but it's like, sometimes that's people's reality. I don't really have a nice way to conclude that thought, but there you have it.
No, absolutely. That's, as you mentioned, it's still very tough right now, considering that, like you said, the Buffalo shooting upstate, I mean, I really haven't heard much of it either. And as you mentioned, even on the issue of what's going on in Ukraine, that was something that I was going to touch on. And then I thought to myself, well, we haven't heard much of that either since since the height of that war going on. So, it's very interesting to see how, news cycles, operate, and how sometimes we kind of, push to the back burner some of the prevalent ongoing issues that are still happening now. So same question, Robert. I know you mentioned earlier that we'll never quite get to 100% in terms of being able to fully every area when it comes to covering diversity issues. But I guess, how can we get closer to being able to completely cover or continue to cover issues around diversity? I mean, what kind of issues would you like to see? What kind of stories would you like to see covered more of, surrounding diversity issues going forward?
Well, I would give two primary examples, answers to that. One is all of these big national issues, as we've mentioned here, can be localized and can be localized to diverse communities here. The pandemic, which was the example raised earlier, is a perfect example of that. But any of them, I mean, the Buffalo shooting, obviously there's tremendous fear that could have just as easily happened here. I mean, there were reports that Hempstead could have been an option. So, so it is essential with any of these stories, and a lot of what we do at Newsday is try to take what's happening on a national front and bring it home here and convey it and tell those stories in ways that resonate for Long Islanders. So any of these stories can be done. The problem is that the default often tends to be localizing it for a certain type of Long Islander or a certain type of community, and not necessarily thinking about the range of emotions and feelings before then everyone has to just shuffle off to the next hot thing on the, you know what I mean, the thing we have to pay attention to in the news cycle, the next big story. And I mean, in newsrooms in general are not, it's no big secret, staffed as robustly as they used to. So the ability to do the kind of stories that I think are hugely important, that other panelists have also mentioned, which is to go into the communities and embed yourself in the communities and to be there and to be a presence and to be someone people can trust. That is an increasingly endangered species in a lot of ways, because we just have to just do more with less. And so I think what I would personally like to see, what's important, what we prioritize, is to find ways to get reporters into communities, into diverse communities, to listen and to understand, like I said earlier, and that is the primary challenge. And so I would love to see more of that. My favorite stories are stories about regular people doing really, I mean, just to be very simple, regular people doing really interesting, noteworthy things. Everyday Long Islanders, and everyday Long Islanders means everyday Long Islanders from all of the communities that we have. So it's an aspiration. It's something we need to do better. It's something we need to do more of. But I think to the extent that priorities can be structured in a way that you can get away from chasing the big story of the day before completely dropping it and moving on to the next big story of the day, and actually free up reporters to have the time to do this, that's the key. So that's the goal, and that I think ultimately is what would lead to the kind of stuff we're talking about and get us closer to that.
Absolutely. No, those are very, very important points, Robert. Thank you again. And Maya, same question. I mean, especially in your role as someone who is, gathering news via social media, whether it be trending news stories, feature stories, and what have you, breaking news stories for that matter. I mean, what kind of stories would you like to see, I guess, surrounding diversity issues? Would you like to see, covered more, I guess, or put out there more going forward? I mean, especially in your role.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a couple of points I had in my mind. I remember you asked, like, how can we keep these diverse stories going? How can we keep this conversation going? And I just wanted to add that I think we need people who do care, who truly care, and people who empathize, I think, as well. That's exactly like how I find stories, is I usually empathize with someone's story or this, local problem going on. And then I find out more about it. And it's like, wow, this is a story that everybody needs to hear. So maybe, some way something can happen that will help them, or that will push the conversation even more. And I think, so I interned with CNN, and this was a new unit too, is the Race and Equality Unit. And this was something that was made after George Floyd. So I think that was progress there. And it was nice, the whole team, like every day we would look for stories regarding race and equality, whether it was a good story or a bad story in terms of like, a negative thing happening to someone or a positive accomplishment. But yeah, we would look for those stories daily. So I think that there just needs to be that kind of unit, or at least that kind of sense, that kind of motivation in different newsrooms to look for stories like that. And even now at NBC, like all of my colleagues know that I do have a strong interest in race and equality. So I always tend to look for stories that are surrounding that. So like I check local affiliates, I check theroot.com, which focuses on Black content. And I look for stories that, like local stories that could be a national topic. So kind of like the opposite of what you were talking about, Robert. And like, for example, with CNN, at least, I worked on a story in regarding to, it was, so you know how, let me look it up. Okay, so it was basically the city of Jackson. They were struggling with a lot of with water, basically. They didn't have access to water. The city it's been an ongoing issue for a long time. And we saw this in Flint as well. So it's kind of continuing the conversation, showing that this isn't something that just happened a couple of years ago. It's still happening in Jackson here, and maybe happening in another town over there. And the trend that we see is it's affecting African-American people. So I think that's one of the main things I look for is patterns and trends, especially if something happened a couple of years ago, like Hurricane Katrina, when's the next storm going to happen and how's it going to affect people there? So I think it's just kind of preparing and seeing the systemic patterns that we see and kind of pointing them out and bringing them to the surface.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Maya. It sounds really like, I feel like, especially as a reporter, there has to be somewhat of a hunger to seek out these stories as well and to continue to stay on top of it. I think sometimes it comes down, of course, it's important to come from the top, but sometimes it comes down to each of the individual reporters to have that hunger to, seek out these stories, especially surrounding diversity issues, and continuing to sort of take it upon themselves to continue to shine light on these issues. So lastly, Amy, same question. I mean, from your perspective, do you feel like there's been enough continued coverage of diversity issues since the 2020 demonstrations? And secondly, on top of that, what kind of stories would you like to see more of, going forward as we continue to cover things around diversity issues?
I don't think there will ever be enough. Unfortunately, I think it's something that we continue to struggle with. One of the things that I was just thinking about was we don't really go back to stories as much as we should, any kind of story, right? So we talked earlier about the demonstrations and the 5-year-old girl that was out there demonstrating. Has anyone gone back to see, what she's doing now, how things have changed? It's something that we probably should pursue, because that was such an impactful time in the summer of 2020. And where are all those people who were demonstrating back then, and have things gotten better? And I don't think they have. Maybe we've come a little further than we were, but there's so much more work that needs to be done. And I think journalists tend to tell a story once and then move on, when there's so many more parts to that story that we can continue. And I think in a newsroom, the reporters and producers are the ones that hear the same thing over and over again. So we tend to say, oh, well, we've been covering that forever, let's do something else. When really, to the viewer, there's so much more to that story that we haven't even told yet. So I think it's really important as journalists to continue to go back to the stories that we've covered, because there's so much more to tell that, a lot of times we just scratch the surface and move on.
No, absolutely. That's such a great point as well, Amy, is continuing to flesh out the story a bit. I mean, I've been in that position too, where we had, a big story, and then, initially we kind of say, okay, that's it, when really there's a lot more to it. And so what we would do, especially at my time at the Herald, is we would split the story into, 2 or 3 or 4 parts, where we would, kind of stretch it out a bit. And maybe it wouldn't come out every week, but at the very least, we would keep the readers informed as to what's happening around this particular story, whether it be, diversity issues or, other local related issues that affects the community. And so I feel like, as you mentioned, it's kind of important to flesh out these stories, especially when it's such a big topic of discussion. So thank you for bringing up that point, Amy. All right, thank you. Thank you again to all the panelists. We are on to the Q&A portion of our panel discussion now. And the first question is from Dr. Georgette Greer-Key. Her question to the panelists is, how can we use community voices who are on the ground, or community columns? And I'll pitch this to any of the panelists to, jump in and answer.
Well, I can say that community voices on the ground are the lifeblood of doing the kind of journalism we're talking about. So we want to hear from people. It is urgently important that anyone who feels they have a story to tell or a tip to offer, and I'm sure everyone here would agree, we want to hear from you. You know, there, we cannot, like I said, I spend my entire day sitting in this desk, right? We cannot generate news without being invested in and involved in the communities. As far as community columns, I know, you know, at Newsday, we have the kind of old-fashioned church and state separation of the news and opinion sections, but I know for a fact that they run a lot of op-eds and are very interested in hearing from people in general. So there's a process. I know they get a lot of them. So, you know, I can't elaborate. I have no knowledge really of their decision process in general, but I would say that it's hugely, hugely important, and that any of us embrace hearing from people on the ground.
Any of the other panelists would like to touch on that question? Okay, let's
Go
ahead, sorry.
Quick. No, you're good. Yeah, I'll just add, I think it's really important as well. Community voices are a huge part of a story, especially with my job. Like, the main thing I do is scroll through Twitter, scroll through Instagram, through Snapchat, and I look at people who are telling stories, or people who are tagging, you know, NBC, CNN, or their local media about a story that they have. And then boom, you know, there's a story. I think it's also important to let the community know, let your viewers know that you are open to hearing their stories. You know, you're open to tips. So like in my bio, like I have my email there. And then whenever I see someone comment about a story, I say, you know, hi, I'm interested in the story. My DMs are open if you're interested in speaking with me. So that kind of thing. So just kind of having that demeanor as well, like that friendly, open demeanor with them too, I think is good. So yeah, I think community voices are 100%, like, they make up the story. So definitely seek them out in any way you can.
Absolutely. And our second question was from Cecilia Dowd. She had a question about the protests.
Hey, Nakeem, thank you, everybody. Sorry, it was too long to type out, but as journalists, we're taught, like, there's two sides to every story, or arguably there's two sides and then there's the truth. But what I'm curious about is the protests in 2020 got such a bad rap, right? You know, all these raucous protests, when in fact, at least here on Long Island, the protesters were largely peaceful. But what I experienced as a reporter were the counter protesters who actually were the ones causing trouble. And I'm just curious to the panelists how you chose to handle the counter protesters who disrupted these largely peaceful, if not fully peaceful, protests.
I can talk to that a little bit. We were actually just talking about that in our newsroom today, how the demonstrations on Long Island were peaceful, and it wasn't the original demonstrators who were causing all the problems. So, you know, we really tried to tell the story, you know, in the way it was happening. These demonstrations are peaceful. This handful of people came in and started to cause problems. They had nothing to do with the demonstration. So I think, you know, we just had to tell the story as it was, because that's what was happening in front of us. But like you said, I mean, the demonstrations on Long Island were very different than some of the demonstrations you saw across the country. Everyone was peaceful except for those few people who had to come out and cause problems. And we just were very clear to our viewers as to what was happening. Peaceful demonstrations and people causing problems, unrelated.
I think as I'm going to piggyback off of you, Amy. I think as a Minnesotan, watching and like literally living really close to like where everything was being burned, it also was a very similar situation where peaceful protesters got conflated with like out-of-state anarchists that came in and kind of took advantage of the momentum and the messaging, and kind of blew the protests out of proportion, and kind of in some ways I would say tried to undermine the movement that was happening, because then it became less about Black lives and like police brutality, and it became more about property damage. And what was a little frustrating is that it didn't come out until a little bit after. I mean, because Minnesota was kind of ground zero, so it was hard when you see things burning. It was hard to like decipher who was doing a lot of it, but it became an issue because it came out after that a lot of the people that were actually partaking in the actual damage weren't a part of the people who were protesting peacefully, but it didn't come out right away. So I think that kind of created some initial distrust in the media there. But I think, like Amy said, highlighting those distinctions are important, and also highlighting the ways that certain groups are able to protest and others aren't is also very key. I don't know why I did this, but when I was a senior in college, my junior in college, during my first semester, I had the brilliant idea of going to a Trump white supremacist rally that was marching in Minnesota, and then that evening going to a Black Lives Matter rally, because I wanted to compare and contrast how each group was perceived, how the police interacted with each group, the coverage that it got, the way, just like the overall how each group was perceived, and how each group was, I'm trying to find the word, but like embraced. That's kind of a weird word, but I'm going to say embraced. And it was very interesting that when I was at this white supremacist Trump rally thing, the police officers were smiling. There were people at the Minnesota Capitol with guns. They were showing off their guns to police officers. No qualm. And I was like, imagine if these people were Black and they were at the state capitol with guns on the lawn. That just wouldn't be the same thing. And just like the overall energy and what people were chanting. I don't know why I had that bright idea, but ever since that kind of interaction, I was like, okay, there's just kind of a clear, stark difference in how each group is dealt with, the media coverage surrounding it, and how the police interact with those groups as well. I don't know if that answered the question, but I kind of ran my mouth a little bit.
No, I appreciate it. It does, because it was a tricky thing, because there were times, I think, for the reporters in the room who, obviously everybody has a right to their opinion and free speech, but things got really ugly, particularly towards us even at some of these protests. And obviously you have to tell both sides of the story, but do you want to, have that hatred? How much of it do you tell? It was a struggle on our end, I think for a lot of us, but.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that, that, you want to be careful about misrepresenting the extent to which the people who disrupted these protests, or in the case of, say, the Long Island Loud Majority Group, actually represent parents opposed to vaccinations, for example, by presenting a kind of false equivalency, and so we've had a lot of discussions internally about how to contextualize this stuff right, because they're very loud, they're present a lot, but what are we really talking about here? And so I think in the case of the counter protesters and the disruptions that Cecilia is talking about, it's important to not we were never probably really talking about thousands upon thousands of people. I mean, there were some loud, angry, aggressive people. I remember it well. Cecilia and I talked about it all the time. But it was an important consideration to not necessarily give them, to be honest about it and present it, but to not give them more oxygen than warranted.
And another question we have, from Brenda Simmons. I'll get to David North's question after this. Brenda Simmons, she's the executive director of the Southampton African American Museum. And her question is, there are continuous stories and efforts about housing, about affordable housing, which is good, but little to no coverage about gentrification. Why is gentrification, missing from the conversation?
Well, I will say that it shouldn't be. And what I said earlier about the imperfect nature of the way that newsrooms are structured, and the reality that we have a lot to learn and a lot that we can do better. it fits here. It's an incredibly important topic. It's something we would love to cover more of, and it's really should be an important focus, and I think aspirationally is an important focus. It's just to a large extent about carving out, it's not just saying it's priority, but carving out the time and the space and the ability to report out stories about topics like gentrification to really make them a priority. It's a goal. It's something we need to do better at. It's definitely a humongous story on Long Island, and that's my take on it from a Newsday standpoint.
Any of the other panelists would like to touch on that, or can we go to the next one?
I'll add in something quick. So when I was interning with CNN, I did a story about a couple in North Carolina. They were trying to buy an old school that wasn't used anymore, but it was really important to the community because it was the first African-American school in that town. And they're for years, they've been trying to buy that school. They wanted to restore it because they're both teachers, and they wanted to make it a school so even their own children could go there. And it's been happening for years. Their children are in high school, about to graduate. So obviously their dream could be accomplished. And when I spoke to them, they said the main reason why is because of gentrification. And when I would bring this up to town officials, to get both sides from the couple and then from the town, they would say, no, like this isn't what's happening. We're not stalling efforts or anything like that. We're not trying to push, Black people. We're not trying to push out African-American people from the town. So I think it's hard to talk about because a lot of people won't, or a lot of town officials won't admit that that is what is happening in the town. I don't think they see it as gentrification. They just see it as we're making the town, I don't know, we're trying to better the town, that kind of thing. So I think it's hard to talk about it when people won't admit that it's actually happening. But I think it's up to us to keep pushing that, to keep looking at the patterns that are happening again with gentrification across the country. And is gentrification always happening in African-American towns or Latino towns, So yeah, that's just my 2 cents to that.
Great. Thanks so much, Maya. And David, you had the next question. You can ask your question on camera if you'd like.
Okay, actually, when I tossed in my question, the conversation has moved on. I'd just like to say to Robert, Newsday should take credit for the housing series you guys did not so long ago to kind of expose the discrimination and profit motive that results in gentrification. And Cecilia's question too, it's just the importance of a panel like this. The more effectively we communicate and get to know each other better, the less fear and the less threat of violence. So the work that we're all doing is so important to keep our community progressing and moving forward. My question, and I guess we really don't have a lot of time to address this, it's mostly a concern about covering communities when there's not a crisis, so that we regard communities as our neighbors and not just demographics to exploit when there's an emergency. So I don't know if you guys want to comment on that. That was my comment, I guess, as we reach the end of this program.
I'll just say that really quick that I could not possibly agree more with that. And like I was saying earlier about wanting to tell stories about real people living their real lives in an ordinary way that's also interesting and worth telling at the same time, that is the whole key. And that has got to be more of something that we not just talk about, but that we focus on. And it certainly is something we'd like to, but I don't want to take more time there. So go ahead, Amy, or whoever else.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's really important to us to be in all of the communities and tell stories that matter to Long Islanders. And I think that it's hard to be everywhere on Long Island, but we really are trying to be that station that shares everything that Long Island has to offer, all of the stories that need to be told, whether they're good or bad, but making sure that we're continuing to come back into any community we possibly can. And that's why it's so important to have that open dialogue with our viewers, because there are stories out there that we don't know about, and we need people to bring them to our attention so those stories can get the proper time that they need to get.
I'm gonna just bop in really quick, and then I know we're out of time, but I would just say that apart from just individual stories, I feel like journalists have a responsibility in terms of media framing, because essentially what we do is we frame how people see the world. So if we're only framing a particular group of people as very negative, or when bad things are happening, or turmoil or crisis, that shapes the way people perceive those communities and interact with those communities. So it's our job to highlight to essentially humanize people, so that we're not just going in when bad things are happening, but highlighting personalities, inspiration, things that are uplifting, because people are constantly overcoming things just by kind of living in the United States as a person of color. So highlighting even the small feats, so that you're really humanizing a population, because again, media framing essentially frames how people perceive the world. And it's our job as journalists to make sure that we're giving the most accurate and holistic framing of issues.
Great. Thank you for that. I appreciate your follow-up. And just one more follow-up question from Dr. Greer-Keith.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I was typing in, and as you said that, Akeem, so it's, thank you. I wanted to thank everybody for their statements tonight. I took a lot of notes, and thank a lot of the general public and members who have joined us. I was writing down, I believe Ryan said that a lot of your stories is the first draft of history. And for me, as a historian, that's very important, because a lot of the documents that we have in our historical record come from the historic record. Now, sometimes there are things wrong, and we can fix that easily. But I'm just noticing more and more that some of the reportings, and I'm not saying any one of your institutions or you as writers have done this, but how do we ensure that it is ethically and abiding by the rules? Like, I remember learning that you have to write on the 8th grade level as a reporter, and all of these things that your club, I'm sure, it makes sure your members uphold to. But I've seen too many papers recently that I could not collect and keep in my historic record for my historical society. And that poses a really big problem. But I am encouraged by a lot of what the writers and journalists have said here tonight. And I think if that's a topic you can talk to, with the rest of your writers, I would appreciate it. I have so many issues that have been not covered correctly. For instance, in Oceanside, there was a picture shown of this person versus that person. And if the tables were turned, it would have been a different story. Or the political record of what's been going on has not always been correct. And so I just implore you that we as historical societies are depending on your reporting and your writing for our historic record, as Ryan has noted. So how can we ensure that ethic is upheld by your writers and your fellow journalists? Is there any way for you to make sure that that continues? And this goes for social media as well.
It's a really great question, and it's a really great point. And I think that, just succinctly, I mean, I could spend 20 minutes talking about this, but just very succinctly, I would say a key is to not overload the people doing the reporting by making them chase a million stories a day and then a million stories the next day, and letting them have the time and the space to consider what they're doing with the right amount of time, and to not just throw them from one thing to another. And particularly for all of us, and it would, again, the news cycle, it's very fast. We have an obligation to keep up, and it is finding a way to not compel people to just do this, this, and this, but to spend the time to get everything right, to really focus on the story. Because when it comes to writing anyway, and TV too in its own way also, any form of journalism, telling the story, it's not just reporting, it's writing, it's a craft. And if you don't have the time to do it right because you're being run all over the place and chasing a million things a day, that's when things like that happen, from my perspective.
Great. Would any of the other panelists like to briefly touch on that? Okay. Thank you all so much. I know I'm going to pitch it back to Brendan briefly, but I just wanted to thank everyone personally for taking the time to tune into this discussion tonight. I think it was very productive. Thank you to all the panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules again for sharing their insight as well. Much appreciated. And yeah, we can pitch it back to Brendan to close it out.
Thank you so much, Amudalat. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Amy. And Nakeem, thank you so much for moderating our event tonight. We are the Press Club of Long Island. You could find out more about us on pcli.org. You could follow us on Twitter. We're at PCLI. We're also on Instagram now, Press Club of LI. And we're on Facebook, Press Club of Long Island. Look us up, like us, follow us, tweet at us. And please, if you're not already a member of the Society of Professional Journalists and you are a journalist or an aspiring journalist, please join. You could find out more about joining at spj.org. And if you are a Long Islander, please make sure to designate the Press Club of Long Island as your local chapter. There's no extra cost to join the Press Club of Long Island as your chapter once you are a member of SPJ. If you would like to replay this event, we will have it on our Facebook page immediately. And we're going to post an edited version on YouTube in the coming days. Please keep up with us on pcli.org. You'll see there or on our Facebook page ways to subscribe to our newsletter so you could be apprised of our future events. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. We can't have these events without a great audience like you, and thank you for your thoughtful questions.